Thank you. All right, so I have just 10 minutes, so I'll have to go really fast because I love sharing a lot of slides. But anyway, I'm going to be talking about the importance of crypto in Web3, culture in Web3. So just moving on to the slide, culture Web3 in the metaverse. You already know about, or you can check us out online at Animoca Brands. So we have over 420 investments in the space since 2017, 2018. One of the most active, I guess, sort of builders in the space as well. And you know, one of the things that we always talk about, and I think you noticed already, but it's worth reiterating, is that we think of the metaverse and everything that happens in layer 1, layer 2 blockchains very much like national economies. So it's like a country. So in other words, when you look at the value of something like the Ethereum blockchain, you can't look at it as the amount of gas that is basically being sort of, you know, spent on as the value of the network. In fact, it's what happens with the developers, the ecosystems that are built on top of it, and the same with things like Sandbox, for instance. The other thing that powers this infrastructure of this open metaverse, just like the economies, is that we now have over $12 billion basically locked in DAOs, right? Whether it's ApeCoin or other sort of DAOs around the world, which is basically like a community-funded treasury. And if you haven't accessed basically these DAOs that you can sort of partake in, then you know you definitely should think of it as alternative forms of funding, for instance, or other areas in which you can grow, very much like corporate treasuries in the physical world. The other thing that powers this, you already know again, is DeFi. And of course, if it wasn't for DeFi, you wouldn't have this explosive growth in NFTs that we've experienced and the whole sort of economic framework. But very much like the physical world, DeFi is the banking sort of infrastructure of this open metaverse. Last year, over $100 billion of value was locked in these DeFi protocols like Uniswap or PancakeSwap, which is, you know, just roughly a little lower than the Bank of Singapore and higher than the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, just to give you an idea that, again, they mimic those of actual economies. So I wanted to talk about culture because in America, last year, arts and culture was the second largest service industry at close to $900 billion, just below retail trade at about $1.2 trillion. And of course, that means arts and culture, people working in movies and in music and gaming, very important industry. But when you look at actually what culture impacts, all of retail and trade, all of the things that we do in maybe even outdoor recreation, things we purchase, places we live in, are actually impacted by a form of culture. For instance, if you're buying clothes, you're not actually buying clothes just because, you know, of its utility. You're buying clothes because of its meaning or because of its purpose, because of what it says about you. You're choosing a Nike or an Adidas for a cultural reason. You're not buying it purely for utility. And in fact, if you think about all the smart TVs or the televisions, sorry, or the radios we used to buy, or you know, HBO, Marvel, like think about all the things you interact with in the physical world, and it's actually all culture. So cultural is the most important element of everything that we do. In fact, a country that has low culture typically has very poor economic outputs and very low cultural impact, for that matter. So in that sense, if it can mimic that in the, you know, if you think of the open metaverse as an economy like in the physical world, then culture should perhaps be just as important in the digital world. So this is an example, I guess for most of you here, it wouldn't be a surprise because, you know, it's an NFT conference, so you would know that, you know, Bored Apes are more valuable than Birkin bags. But I give this example often because for people who are not as initiated as most of you are here most likely, the value of a Birkin bag is not the utility of putting things in the bag, right? You don't buy a Birkin bag because you can put stuff in it. Everything around the value of a Birkin bag is cultural. Its network effects are cultural. The aspects of its influence, all of that is maybe invisible, but they are network effects embedded by owning it because of its fame, because of its implications, because of what friends say, all that kind of stuff. And the same is true for Bored Ape. So the difference between that is one of them is 100% virtual, the other one is 99% virtual in terms of value. So the leap is not that big. And again, it's cultural in context, which basically explains things about how we think of the places that we live in. In the physical places, or if you choose to live in Beverly Hills or, you know, in places like the Peak, that's actual cultural context. Even national identity is cultural in context as well. Are you American? Are you from China? Are you from Japan? There are implications that actually identify you with culture. Food, for instance, is actually culture as well. It's not utility in itself. Sure, you know, we eat to sustain ourselves, but we actually eat to enjoy the cultures of our own cultures or of others. So, you know, one of the things that happens though then, like what we have in physical economies, is that these cultural items are now in these forms of non-fungible tokens. We describe NFTs as stores of culture. You have now the ability, as you have in the physical world, to have interoperability, meaning that these items can be used across multiple metaverses, across multiple ecosystems. Famous examples would be like you could take a game and an item and you could use it in 3 or 4 other kind of games, for instance. But that's not the only thing in terms of network effects that have this utility, because you can take these NFTs and you can get a loan for them. You can put them on PawnFi or you can put them on NFTFi and you can get a loan. That's another kind of network effect. And think about how this works in the physical world. In the physical world, the fact that we have decentralized ownership of cars or of iPhones or of houses and real estate is the reason why you can have a ecosystem of different businesses evolve around the ownership of others. If we didn't have decentralized ownership of cars, if we had to always seek permission from the creator of the cars to do stuff, there wouldn't be an Uber, there wouldn't be a Lyft, we wouldn't have people making baby seats, we wouldn't have people making different tires, we wouldn't have phone cases. None of that would be possible if it wasn't for decentralized ownership of these cultural artifacts. Very similar to the fact that maybe 100 years ago you bought a car to take you from point A to point B, which is like the Ford Model T, and today that's a given. The utility of the car is just something it ought to do. The reason you buy this car or the other car is entirely cultural. So I want to close a little bit on the topic of video games. First of all, video games is probably the most native digital culture that has emerged over the last 20 years and is digital first, unlike other forms of culture, which typically came from from physical into virtual. Here, it's virtual into physical. Just think about everything that we're using today. For instance, if you use Razer keyboards, if you're using curved screens, if you're using NVIDIA graphic cards, all of these actually came because of the gaming industry. Gaming was utility. And now we had the benefit of these incredible graphic cards because gaming was the reason they did it. So gaming was the industry that pushed many of the things we use today forward, but digitally first, then with a physical influence. That industry is now a $200 billion industry, which is basically bigger than music and film combined. Impacts over 3.4 billion people today and growing, which is basically more than 2/3 of the world's internet. And we spent $100 billion last year on virtual items in a rental model, which is the gaming world outside of Web3 gaming. Web3 gaming, you can have ownership, but in Web2, of course, you don't. But what's also interesting for those who don't play games is that of that $100 billion, the vast majority is entirely cosmetic in nature. So if you're playing Fortnite, for instance, one of the most popular games in the world, you're buying skins. The skins don't make you faster, they don't make you more powerful, they just make you look cool. So the virtual world in gaming is already very much like the physical world. We don't buy many of our shoes so we can run faster. We buy them because they're cool, because they say something about us. So, in closing, the correlation with digital property rights, things that we can truly own, needs to be stored in non-fungible tokens that are these stores of cultural value, as we say. It protects our intellectual property rights, like as you see things like with, when you buy a Bored Ape, by owning the Bored Ape, you also contain with it those rights. Mimic very much the kind of protection of property rights you have in the physical world, as well as the intellectual property rights that we can see happen in very developed countries. All countries in the parallel of economies that have strong property rights have high GDPs, going back to the example of comparing them to actual economies. So America, Switzerland, Hong Kong, those places have high GDPs versus other places maybe in sub-Saharan Africa or an extreme case like North Korea, where you have no property rights. You don't own anything, you have no protection. If you own a property, you can actually get yield from it, for instance. That is something that you can do in those places. They also have correlating higher freedoms. All places that have property rights also have correlated higher freedoms as well. And the other thing we can now see with this example is what we're seeing in the world of NFTs. Last year, in what's the apparent bear market of crypto, $24 billion of NFTs were sold. That's a big number. Roughly the same as a year before, in fact, of which 90% went to creators and owners. Spotify, which is the largest royalty payer in terms, certainly the music industry, paid out $7 billion only to its creators. Of course, nothing to the owners, because there's no owner concept in music. It's all rental in construction. But in Spotify, you have 300 million listeners, and you have millions of creators, versus, as we all know in Web3, we have very few. And this is the example that we see in the physical world between property rights, where it's not about every user basically having an ARPU, but it's about the value of those users because of the capital formation that can take place, which is also why Web3, we believe, is the future of the internet. So I'm running out of time, so I'm going to conclude with, oh, okay, no conclusion on this one, but anyway, our point is digital property rights is, you know, we need to have digital property rights in order to also have our freedom and digital liberties. So thank you very much.
Oh, yes.